This video is about the harms that are attributable to substance use. We're going to talk about a couple different types of harms generally. Some of the harms are the direct harm, so the things that the substances cause themselves directly. Then we're going to talk about indirect harms. So substance use can be a risk factor for another disease, and then we'll talk about kind of the impact of being a risk factor versus being a direct factor. So substance use generally has short-term and long-term consequences. The short-term consequences include things like injuries, overdose, and infectious diseases. Injuries themselves are typically the result of intoxication. So you have cognitive impairment, you have physical impairment, that you just you don't function as you normally would when you're not on a particular substance. These can include things like motor vehicle crashes, falls, drownings, but also intentional violence. So homicide, suicide, assault, intimate partner violence can be the result of substance use. When it comes to overdose, we're talking not just illicit drugs, but also legal drugs. So this includes things like alcohol poisoning. And the overdose risk does vary quite substantially by the substances involved. So overdose risk for opioids and heroin are particularly high. Overdose risk for marijuana is almost non-existent. I personally have not heard of a case where someone has OD'd using only marijuana. And the symptoms of overdose vary by substance as well, which makes sense. They all work a little bit differently. They all impact different parts of the nervous system in the body. So when you're talking about opioids, you're talking about respiratory depression, so you're actually lowering the rate at someone breathes. Cocaine or amphetamines are almost the opposite. They're stimulants, so they're increasing your heart rate, increasing your breath rate. They can actually cause myocardial infarction, heart attacks, or even strokes. MDMA causes you to produce a lot of body heat, so you can actually have hyperthermia. And it's pretty straightforward. Hopefully this is common sense. The more you use it, the greater risk you are for having an overdose. I bring this up to show that both that there is an opioid epidemic in the United States. The number of deaths per 100,000 people in the U.S. due to opioids has been increasing for the last 2 decades. But also to say that what people are overdosing on has changed over the last 2 decades as well. So if you look at the very small dotted line that's heroin, up until 2010, there actually weren't a lot of people overdosing on heroin. This has increased substantially since 2010. It's not a straight line up, but that's a pretty steep curve up. At the same time, the number of people overdosing on the prescription drugs, the natural and semi-synthetic opioids, has kind of leveled off. And this is partly due to people who become addicted to opioids through their prescriptions, turning to heroin as an alternative because it can actually be cheaper, but not necessarily knowing how to properly dose themselves, because street heroin is not going to have consistent purity and quality. I also want to have you note that the weird kind of dashed with big dashes and small dashes of synthetic opioids. Look at this line. It's basically the bottom line up until 2013, 2014. And here you see a sharp uptick in the number of people overdosing and dying from overdose on these synthetic opioids. Synthetic opioids are things like fentanyl and carfentanil, which are very, very powerful, and even just a little bit more than intended use can cause an overdose death. This is kind of the new part of the opioid epidemic with these synthetic opioids, and something that is definitely worth keeping an eye on in the news as we go forward. Now, infectious disease. When it comes to substance use, there are both direct and indirect risks of an infectious disease. The direct risk comes from things like injection drug use, where if you share needles, you are at a greater risk of contracting things like HIV and hepatitis B and C. There's also indirect risk. So substance use is a risk factor for risky sexual activities. And if you're engaging in risky sexual activities at a high frequency, you're more likely to get sexually transmitted diseases. So infectious diseases are a large concern among the substance use using population. But as I said before, substance use has both short-term and long-term consequences. Long-term consequences include non-communicable diseases, chronic diseases, as well as mental illness. The non-communicable diseases, the chronic diseases, include the things that we tend to worry about the most generally in the public health community. So heart disease, cancer, dementia, stroke. We have a little bit more specificity as well, so liver disease. But these are all kind of high impact diseases that substance use can be a very strong risk factor for and a causal risk factor for. Mental illness is a little trickier. So substance use disorder itself is classified as a mental illness. And there are elevated rates of non-substance mental orders in the substance use population. So substance use and mental illness have a very high rate of comorbidity. In this example, 78% of opioid addicts had one or more comorbid mental illnesses. This includes things like major depression, the anxiety disorders, as well as things like schizophrenia. But we don't know necessarily what direction this relationship goes in. Did the mental disorder come first and you're using the substances to self-medicate, or did the substance occur first and that actually cause the mental illness? Now, most people, in the majority of cases, substance users don't cause the mental illness itself, but the diagnostic criteria do overlap quite substantially. And the symptoms of the other mental illness, the comorbid mental illness, the depression, the anxiety, the schizophrenia, often go away once the substance use ceases. So while they may not necessarily cause each other, they might, but we don't know necessarily which came first. All right, so those are very briefly the short-term consequences and the long-term consequences of substance use. But what is the overall impact? Like, it's great to say, I guess it's not great, but it's important to say that, mental illness and substance use have a high rate of comorbidity. But what is actually the health impact, particularly given that a relatively small population of the world, let alone any individual country, are actually problematic drug users? Well, we can get this information from the Global Burden of Disease study, which has been going on for decades. It's an international study, and the idea behind it is to standardize the measure of the prevalence and impact of disease. And there's two types of information I'm going to show you. One is just straight mortality, and the other is disability-adjusted life years. And a disability-adjusted life year is a metric that combines the number of years of loss due to ill health, the number of years that a person may be disabled from a certain action or disease, as well as premature mortality. So it kind of lumps all of these things into one standardized comparable metric that can be used across geographic regions. So when we look at substance use disorders, we see that the age standardized mortality in 2015 was on the range of almost 0 to 5 for liver, based on what specifics you're looking at. And it's important to note that in this graph, in this chart, this is death specifically due to the disorder itself. It's not those other related diseases that substance use can be the risk factor for, but this is actually death due to the substance use itself. So that's why we see a little bit higher rates for alcohol use, for instance. So liver disease due to alcohol use is higher than alcohol use disorder itself. So if we look at just the alcohol, we see alcohol use disorders, about 2 people per 100,000 deaths in the world were caused by alcohol use disorder. Roughly the same amount for opioid use disorders, but much lower amounts, almost 0 for cocaine and amphetamine use disorder. When we put this in context next to cardiovascular disease and cancer, which are on the furthest right and are those really big tall columns, the mortality due to substance uses are almost non-existent. It's something we worry about, but it's simply not very prevalent. We can do the same thing with the dailies, the disability-adjusted life years. So alcohol use disorders cause about 150 dailies per 100,000 dailies in 2015. Drug use disorders all were about 225. And then you have like the liver disease and liver cancer specifically due to alcohol use disorders, which kind of add on to that a little bit. But when we put it in context, it's much lower than the amount of dailies caused by cardiovascular disease and cancer. So I just want to put this in context. It's not that substance use isn't a problem. It is, and it is a big public health problem, particularly tobacco use, alcohol use, marijuana use, opioid use. There's a lot of those users, and they have a large impact both on themselves as well as population health, as well as our healthcare systems. But when we look at any of these individually, they don't have the same impact on public health as cardiovascular disease and cancer. And this is why we often talk about substance use as a risk factor for these other diseases rather than as a disease on its own in terms of their public health impact. So here are the disability adjusted life years for substance use as a risk factor. So tobacco smoke causes 170,000 dailies per year. Actually, this is 170 million dailies per year. I apologize, I read my own chart wrong. When we look at alcohol, we see it causes 80 million dailies in 2015. So even though they're not causing a large amount of deaths directly and a large amount of disability directly, they are causing a lot of amount of disability because they are a risk factor for other diseases down the causal chain. Now, tobacco use. Let's highlight tobacco use a little bit. It's still priority number one in the public health community. It's kind of spun off the tobacco control movement. Is kind of almost its own field in entirety. About 11.5% of all deaths globally can be attributed to tobacco use, either directly or indirectly. But it's very concentrated. Over half of these deaths are coming only from 4 countries: China, India, Russia, and the US. Now, this is a little bit deceiving because China, India, and the US are 3 of the 4 largest countries in the world, if not the 3 largest countries in the world by population. But it does point out that it is very concentrated. The majority of deaths from tobacco do come from only 4 countries.